Today's podcast is based specifically on some work that I recently did with some of my coworkers at Cycling 74 related to updating some of the canonical objects that people have been using. In this case, this group put together an updated version of the PeRColate objects, which are physical modeling and other kind of obscurities that are just pretty amazing. This is all done through our little hack site called Maxology. It uses the .club TLD, so that's maxology.club. You can check it out there. But in the meantime, I hope that you enjoy this amazing interview with Dan Trueman, one of the people that was involved in the creation of the PeRColate object set. Here you go. Okay, today I'm pleased to introduce you to someone who I've had an opportunity to play with and certainly talk to over the years, someone who I find particular inspiration and someone whose work I've just been interacting with. And so I was really excited to get him on the podcast. His name is Dan Trueman, and I will let him explain at least some of what he does. He's got a resume that'll make your teeth hurt. It's amazing, but I'll let him kind of identify himself. So with that, I say hi to Dan. Hi, Dan. How are you?
I'm doing great. Hi, Darwin. How are you?
All right. Thanks a lot for taking the time to be part of the podcast. So why don't we kick this off by having you explain to people how you think of yourself?
Okay, I'll do my best. So I guess ultimately I just view myself as a musician who has got my finger in a lot of different pots. I grew up playing the violin, but I also grew up with a scientist father, and so I was always drawn to analytical things and sort of hard science and programming and stuff like that. And so a lot of what I do now reflects those starting points. So I perform a lot as a fiddler, sometimes with electronics. I code a lot. I really like to code, and so I spend a lot of time building things that I can then fiddle with, sometimes literally with the fiddle and sometimes, more metaphorically just messing around with something. And then I try to compose music in the process.
Sure.
I also I teach a fair bit. I teach at Princeton, so I teach all of these things in various different guises.
Interesting. That's neat. And really your love of both playing and coding is, I think, something that's going to resonate with a lot of the listeners. It certainly resonates with me.
Yeah.
Your past has got, if you do a little research in the Dan Trueman Google search, you run into a pretty amazing treasure troves of things that you were involved in. And most particularly, and I don't know if we say you get recognition or blame for this, but you are the developer of the laptop orchestra, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Depending on how people feel about laptop orchestras, there you go. But I find them to be an incredible resource, and especially in a teaching environment.
Yeah.
I've gotten a chance to work with the Boulder Laptop Orchestra, which is based out of CU Boulder. Yeah. I would like to hear a little bit more about the development of that. Before we get into some of the other questions, I'm just curious on what was in your head when you just said, let's make an orchestra out of laptops.
Yep. Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it comes back to some of what we were just talking about. As a violinist, as a fiddler, I really love to make music with other people sitting in the room with me, And at the time, so this was sort of in the years before this, we started the Laptop Orchestra in 2005. So in the years leading up to that, I was teaching electronic music at Princeton, and before that at Colgate and Columbia, and always with people working alone for the most part in their studios, and then they would make a track and share that track. So you'd sit back and listen, or you'd go to an electronic music concert and sit down and listen to something that was played over speakers, which is it's all great. And what I'm saying here is not meant to, be a critique of that. But it doesn't have this social music making component to it. This fiddling aspect, sitting or chamber music aspect. This part where you're sitting down and making music with somebody else. And in the classes, teaching the classes, I just always felt very lonely sending the students off and having them make these things rather than actually getting them all in a room together and trying to make music together. So that really was the main motivation for it. And so I remember at the time bouncing this idea off of Perry Cook, who was my colleague in computer science here at the time. And, I don't know, of course, you know Perry, and I bet many of your listeners do, one of the powerhouses of computer music.
Right,
and also a great thinker and an inspiring thinker and somebody who is absolutely game to try just about anything. And so he lit up about this idea. And it also really fed into or off of a bunch of things that we've been working on in the previous decade, really, including we had been building these spherical speakers together. And the point of these spherical speakers was to make a home for electronic sound in the kitchen, let's say, rather than having these big speakers that you're directing it at people. These are meant to be speakers that sit next to you and fill a room with sound, roughly the way an acoustic instrument like the fiddle does. And so he and I had been building these speakers, and at the same time, we had also been sticking sensors all over my violin bow and reading the sensor data, processing it in Max, and using that to control synthesis and signal processing in various ways. And so the laptop orchestra became a perfect venue to bring those things together, and not only ourselves see what we could do with them, but see what a bunch of students would do with them.
So that's very interesting. I was really curious about how those hemispheric speakers tie into it, because it seems like that's one of the identifiers that makes like a random group of laptop people become one of these laptop orchestras. And it's because it actually, there's something about having that speaker and, right next to the laptop that actually makes it seem much more of an instrument than having it piped through a PA.
Yep. Right. So also at the same time period leading up to the laptop orchestra, I had been playing for a number of years with Curtis Bond, a wonderful bass player, composer, musician, and also somebody who spends a lot of time hacking in Max. And he and I had a duo called Interface, and we were doing a lot of improvisations with these instruments we were building. And I remember early on, we did what a lot of electronic musicians do. We just plugged into a PA and played. And that's also great. I love it. I've done that with you. And it's, I love doing that. But it is also hard to know who's doing what. And we wanted to try these speakers in that context, in part just to try to get us grounded a bit in terms of who's doing what and how do these things relate to one another. So I think you're right. I think that the laptop orchestra didn't really make sense to me as a concept until we had this idea of these speakers that really make sound local to the player and fill the room and allow you to blend sounds in a room that come from many, many separate places.
Right. Well, I know from working with them with the Boulder group, one of the things that happens is all of a sudden your sense of volume management also becomes very much like an acoustic instrument. You start thinking of yourself as, how am I blending in? How am I loud enough so that other people respond to me and they know it's me because of the location that they can get from it. Mm-hmm. But also, how am I kind of like fitting into the overall sound? It's a really different kind of playing style than you normally find when you're, working with a laptop in front of people. Because let's face it, a laptop has the ability to make all the noise, right?
That's right.
And so this is almost like a way to sort of damp that down a little bit, but also be kind of honor the fact that there's an audience in the room by saying, here are the players and what they're doing. It's really cool.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks. I mean, and it's funny. I, of course, am a big fan of these and of the way they encourage certain kind of music making together. But on the other hand, it's funny. They're not for everything, and there are times when it's not the right solution. And bringing in a PA or some other kind of speaker system, in-ear monitors, whatever. Sometimes that's the right way to go.
Right.
But one of the things I like about these is that so at the time, it felt like the assumption was always that there was going to be a PA in the room. Uh-huh. And now with these, it feels like, well, there are options. There's ways of thinking about how sound and electronic sound might be in a room together and how acoustic sound and electronic sound might coexist. There are options. There are ways of thinking about it. And that's what I really like about it.
Sure. Well, and it's also, it's clear that there's a connection to your being a fiddle player in that it kind of has this thing of being like, hey, I could be a busker with this thing, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Put my hat out at the subway and make a few bucks, right?
Right. Well, it's funny, you say that the Dublin Laptop Orchestra in Ireland, that was one of their premises, and they wanted to make their systems completely battery powered so that they could just walk out onto Grafton Street, put out a hat, and play. I'm not sure they fully succeeded in doing that, but that was the intention at the beginning.
It's a cool intent.
And actually, Scott Smallwood, he's done a bunch with solar-powered electronic instruments, and I've seen him outside with a big solar panel powering a hemispherical speaker, and everything's being powered right there. It's super cool.
That's awesome. That's cool. Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about your background. One of the things I like to kind of dive into with my conversations is to talk about how you became the artist that you are. And in your case, it sounds like it's going to be pretty complex because it has these two, it's almost like a tree with two trunks. You have such a strong grounding in technology and such a strong grounding in music making and composition, and I'm curious how those grew together and how they complement or distract from each other.
Yeah. So I've been playing violin for as long as I can remember. I started when I was 4, and that has been a constant throughout my life, almost in a ball and chain kind of way. I remember there'd be times where like, oh, geez, if I don't practice for a week, I'm not going to be able to play for the following month. I'll be all out of tune. And so I've always felt like I got to be practicing. But, it's just always been there. And at the same time, like I mentioned earlier, my father is a theoretical physicist at Brookhaven Lab on Long Island. My parents also liked to build instruments. And so I remember when I was a kid, they built 2 harpsichords and a clavichord. And my dad builds lutes, and we have in the living room where I grew up a harpsichord that they built and a piano, a wall covered with recorders, another wall covered with lutes that my dad made. And I remember playing music on these instruments with my sister and my parents.
Right.
When I was growing up. We used to play Baroque trio sonatas and stuff with my mom on the harpsichord and my dad on the recorder, me on the violin. My sister, older sister, is a professional musician, a terrific pianist and composer and singer, and she'd often be either playing recorder or harpsichord, whatever we needed. And so I grew up with that in the house. It seemed all normal at the time. I didn't really realize that wasn't, building harpsichords in the house wasn't,
wasn't standard.
That's right. And actually, it's funny. I remember at some point it became my job to tune the harpsichord. I loved tuning the harpsichord. It had the double sets of strings and so on, so I'd have to tune both sets, and I really enjoyed that. And I think that is also might account for some of the weirdness that cropped up later.
Sure, right.
That was me sort of musically growing up. It's funny. I grew up pretty far out on Long Island, and I had pretty much a standard classical violin training. Even though I had asked to really learn fiddle music, there wasn't much fiddle music out there, or we couldn't find anybody, and so it wasn't until much later that I actually got into fiddle music. I had this whole identity crisis growing up, playing Mozart and Brahms, and I loved that music, but it was clearly not the music that I was meant to be playing. And it took me many years to find that. I'll talk about that a little bit later, because that gets to the Hardanger fiddle, which has been one of my main instruments for the last 20 years. But just again, back when I was a kid, all this music, but at the same time, my dad, a physicist, my mother's a painter. I was very interested in science, and when I went to college, I actually majored in physics. I didn't get a degree in music. I got my undergrad degree in physics, and I loved it. In fact, I loved it for a lot of reasons. I loved the analytical aspect, the rigorous aspect, the writing of equations and the solving of equations to actually make things work, to give you hard numbers,
Right.
But there's an aesthetic aspect to it. I remember learning about Maxwell's equations, these 4 equations that govern electromagnetism. And there's something really elegant and beautiful about them. Of course, physicists talk about elegance and simplicity as being aims, as being parameters that they use to judge whether a theory is successful. And yet at the same time, when you study Maxwell's equations, you find that there are these stray elbows that are sticking out, these constants that they have to add on to make the equations work. It's as if nature is saying, you've almost got me, but not quite. And I love that. And that actually very much appeals to me about music, too. When I'm writing music, I usually feel like if I actually fully understand what I'm writing and what I'm doing, that it's usually boring. When there's the odd elbow that's sticking out, when there's something I really don't fully understand, that usually feels like I'm on the right track, like I'm onto something. So that that really came from studying physics.
Sure.
So anyhow, those things were operating all along for me through college and later. So sometime after college, actually, I've been applying to graduate school in physics, and I remember when I dumped all the applications in the trash because I reached the realization that I was going to have to effectively quit playing violin if I was going to go to graduate school in physics.
Sure.
And I couldn't face it. So I said, all right, I'm going to take a couple years off and be a musician. And that's basically where I am now. I took a couple years off, and the couple years off led to a couple more years off, and I'm still doing it. So I'm very fortunate for that. Right? Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So it's funny how those things go. But so I was just out of school, working for a while, and in fact, this was interesting. I ended up in Seattle, and I was trying to find a way to make a little bit of money while also spending time making music. And at that time, it meant I was a beginning composer. I had just started composing, and I wanted to practice more violin and continue to grow that way. But I needed to make a living, and so I sent around a resume, sort of preposterous, but I sent a resume to all of the scientists in the atmospheric science and oceanography department at the University of Washington, saying, I'm an aspiring musician with a physics degree, and I'm looking for 20 hours a week of work. I'm wondering if any of you would like to hire me. Oh, and it was hilarious. I actually got several responses, including this one scientist, Stephen Harrison, who was a researcher in oceanography out at NOAA in Seattle, right on the lake there. And he was fascinated by the fact that I wanted to be a musician, but that I could also program and so on. And so he hired me for 20 hours a week to work on this physical model of El Nino, this ocean effect out in the Pacific. So I was programming for that group for I guess about a year or so, which was really, I think that's important now that I'm talking to you about it. I haven't actually ever talked to anybody about this. Because that was my first time really programming. And I discovered two things. Number one, that I was pretty good at it, and I liked it.
Right.
I love pressing compiling and having something work.
Right.
There's a sense of closure
Yeah.
that you get from programming that I don't get from a lot of other things. And even writing a piece of music or a particular performance, there's always stuff that that I'm critical of or wish was better. And programming, there's it, like it works or it doesn't. Of course, it could be better, but just the fact that you can get it to work, incredibly satisfying.
Right. Well, what's interesting is if you kind of like put a musical bent on it, doing programming a lot of times is like composing for an audience that's sitting right there. And the second you get a good compile, the audience reacts by being pleased,
Yep.
right?
Yeah, yeah,
It's the
yeah.
kind of turnaround you never get with actually doing music composition.
That's right. That's right. No, it's true. It's immediate and concrete in a way.
Yeah.
That's really satisfying. So that became part of my awareness. Although it's funny, after that, I went to Cincinnati. I somehow persuaded them to take me into their master's program in composition. I will say that during the years off after college, without a music degree, I obsessed on studying music on my own.
Right.
And I learned later that I basically overcompensated. I studied and had done much more than most people do in an undergrad.
Yeah.
So I got to Cincinnati, and some of the composers there would ask me, the faculty would say, "Oh, got a physics degree, you should do computer music." And I said, "Oh, I don't want to do computer music. Oh, that's the last thing I want to do. I want to play violin and fiddle and write music for chamber ensembles and improvisation and so on." Computer music just didn't interest me at all.
Right.
And so I completely stayed away from it as much as I could. I took the obligatory electronic music courses where we spliced tape and so on. Although I did get my first experience with Macs at that time. I remember being shown Macs and programming some things there for the first time. But it wasn't until I'm not sure when, probably a couple years into my time in Cincinnati, that Brad Garton showed up. Brad Garton, who you know well.
Oh, Brad, he's like the Johnny Appleseed for a lot of people. It's unreal.
Yeah, I mean, actually, and at that point, I was done with academia.
Yeah.
I was like, I'm out of here. I'm gonna move to Nashville and try fiddle there, or I'll move to New York and see what can happen there. I was looking into seeing if I could do an internship, like at DigiDesign or something. Anything but being in the academic composition world. And so Brad shows up, and I still remember, I mean, of course, Brad Garton is this great, charismatic character, and his love of music and of computers, programming is infectious. And I remember sitting down with him, and I think I asked him to do this, and he maybe was a little perplexed as to why, but he wrote, probably in 45 seconds, a little program that would print out the values of each sample in a sound file.
Mm-hmm.
And I was just completely turned on. I was like, oh my gosh, I can see the sound.
Right.
I can see everything in there, and I can imagine getting my hands on it.
Right.
And that was the moment I was like, wow, okay, I want to do this. I can program. And this is exciting to me, being able to get down on the low level and, possibly, even if I don't do it, but imagine that I could pull the sound apart bit by bit, was super exciting. So that was it's one of those moments I remember where I was sitting and Brad showing me this program and talking to me about it. It was really a life-changing moment. So I think that's really where I started putting things together and not having an allergy for combining these things that I love. It's funny. I think I had an allergy for this notion of bringing my science side and my music side together. I didn't want to build violins or study acoustics. This is what people talk about often.
Right.
Oh, you do physics, you should study acoustics. I was like, I'm not interested in acoustics. That's not what interested me about physics. But somehow this sense that I could grab hold of the sound in a very methodical way manipulate it was really appealing.
All right. So once you finally gave the idea of computer music an embrace, and you could conceivably go in there and reach around and swirl your finger in the music,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Yeah.
What is it that you found, and what is it that kept you in it? Because frankly, some people do that, and they're like, yeah, "There's nothing interesting in there for me," right?
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, the opposite happened for you. What did you find? What was the magic mushroom in it?
Yeah. um, I think at first there were lots of them that were small and kept me interested for relatively short periods of time. Um, and yeah, so I remember a piece of Brad's also called Approximate Rhythms. And this is a piece where he had built a model basically of a drum ensemble and used it to algorithmically generate a really compelling rhythmic track to this textured piece that he'd made.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that really interesting, this notion of building algorithms that somehow have some kind of sense of humanity in them.
Right, they became players, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Ultimately, I've moved away from that interest. I've not been interested in myself in pursuing algorithmic composition or building virtual musicians that I play with. But that was something that was really intriguing to me. There was also just some, sonic things that really appealed to me. I remember this algorithm that I think Brad wrote in response to something that Terry Pender asked him to write. Of course, you know Terry well also. Terry was at Cincinnati at the time. And it was called Cloudify. The Cloudify was this RTC mix script that would take a sound and granularize it in this beautiful harmonic way, making these clouds of sounds. I just thought this was stunningly beautiful.
Sure.
So I think, the combination of being able to get my hands on it, the sonic possibilities, and this notion of sort of algorithms and bodies, people actually making music, those things kept me in it.
Right.
I made probably 2 or 3, what they called tape pieces at the time, tracks, just where you would, a fixed media piece that you could share.
Right.
I'll be honest, that left me cold pretty quickly. Coming back to the same reason, I just felt like once I had done that, the conversation was over.
Right, right.
For me, the most interesting part of the conversations were always in the making of the music with other people, not in the consuming of the music as sound after the fact. So, I wasn't going to do computer music if that's what it meant. And so right around this time, the computers, this is probably, let's see, so that was, Brad was 93 or 94. And I messed around with these things for 2 or 3 years. And then in 96, I think it was, or 97, computers became fast enough to do some things in real time with sound, with audio. And so this is when MSP came out.
Right.
This is when Super Collider came out. Right. And that was immediately interesting to me because there was a sense, okay, maybe I can do some of these things like Cloudify, that Cloudify algorithm. And when we had done Cloudify, it was like, you type your script and enter it and go get a cup of coffee and come back and then listen to it. Right. Or maybe go to bed and come back the next day and listen to it. But in this case, there was a sense that, wow, we could actually do this as we're playing. This really came together in a powerful way for me with MSP in 1997. with Curtis Bond. I remember Curtis and I sitting in one of the studios together here at Princeton, messing around with MSP, which had just come out. And I wanted to do something like Cloudify, but with my violin sound being cloudified as I played it. And it wasn't apparent to me how I could do that with Max and MSP directly. I mean, obviously people have done that since, but to me at the time it was like, I'm going to do this. And because I liked to program, or I was learning to program more, I delved into the whole process of making external objects for Max. And so I think the first object I made for Max, my memory could be wrong here, but was this object called the Munger, which is basically a real-time granulizer. The idea is to cloudify as you play, so I could play my fiddle, and within 200 milliseconds, this cloud of grains would come out, and I could manipulate those grains and get different textures and so on. But that was the result of sitting in the studio and learning how to hack a Max external, and taking that external and wrapping it in a big Max patch, and making music with it.
Right. Well, it's actually an interesting segue, because one of the reasons why I'm talking to you right now in particular, not that I don't want to talk to you, but is that I just got done working with a team at Cycling. There's a group of us, kind of a little tiger team that basically finds really important old object sets, and we try and refurbish them to bring them up to speed, right?
Yeah.
And we were talking about what we wanted to attack, and I kind of threw out the idea, well, what about PeRColate? And a bunch of people, for me, PeRColate was like blow, tar, and other physical model things, right? But there were two people that specifically, for them, PeRColate means Munger.
Yeah.
That's all they want. They need one object out of the whole set. It's that one, right? It's really funny. But it's interesting because I got a chance to sort of like live in your head for a little while. I got the chance to work with your code, which
I'm so sorry. Sorry.
led me to a bout of drinking.
Of course.
But the end result was pretty cool, because you take a really interesting approach on how you attack the code, but also it was, especially working with the physical model stuff, where you were finding ways to take other people's work and bringing them into that stuff as well, particularly Perry Cook's physical modeling stuff. Now, where was his code running prior to you putting it into these Max objects?
Right. So Perry has a toolkit called the Synthesis Toolkit, right. STK. That's a C++ toolkit that he made in the mid-'90s. I think the sole purpose of it was to avoid answering emails. So people would send him an email and say, well, how does this flute physical model work? And instead of trying to have an answer, 100 emails that said that, he'd say, look, go to the STK and the answer is right there. And right. So he made this nicely commented C++ code with, a wide collection of these physical models.
That's amazing.
Yeah. And so that was great. I mean, for me, it was like, I want these, but I need them in a place where I can use them.
Right.
And I had actually built some instruments from the ground up in C++ and was trying to play with them. And for me, the process of coding and trying and experimenting with what I was making was so slow and frustrating that I was like, I can't work this way. And so that's where, like, having the physical models and having these objects wrapped up in an environment like Max, where you can work really quickly and prototype things and hook this into that and try stuff out and save presets and so on, all of that was super important. So that was the original mission behind PeRColate was, at least for me,
Right.
was to take Perry's synthesis toolkit and this small handful of other objects like the munger and the scrubber and a couple other things and some things that Luc Dubois was making, and basically wrap them up into a big package that we could use and that other people could use.
Sure. Well, the PeRColate stuff, I remember when it first kind of came out, it was sort of like one of those jaw droppers. Like, I can't believe my computer could do this thing. You know,
Right.
It was really amazing. And again, like you say, because you're working in Macs, you can kind of drop it in, and it's like, let's try the blow tar. No,
Right.
let's try the regular guitar. No, let's try the lute. No, you can kind of swing through things like that in real quick order. It was really, really pretty awesome.
Yeah.
How hard was it for you to get that working, or once you got into it, was it relatively straightforward?
Well, I'll try to remember.
I think a lot of people don't even remember, or maybe weren't even around when it was hard for a computer to do real-time audio at all.
Oh, right. I think is one of the interesting things about the physical models is that for the most part, they're actually not particularly intensive in terms of computation. What they do require is very short delay lines, so that you can feed a sample back into itself very quickly. And so they, mostly, I think the physical models ran pretty quickly. The actual creation of the objects, it was a big learning curve for me at first. But once I had one running, I think, as I remember, porting others was sort of, an after-dinner project.
Right.
Which is really, really nice. But, here's the thing. When you do that and you dig into the code a bit, as you see things and you see opportunities to try stuff. So you've mentioned the blow tar. The blow tar doesn't actually exist in Perry's synthesis toolkit. In fact, I think the blow tar still only exists in PeRColate. And it is the result of a conversation I had with Perry, where he pointed out that the physical model for the flute is basically identical to the physical model for the electric guitar. Which, you hear that sentence and go, what? How could that be? It's just not possible. But basically it's true, and it's just a question of which knobs you give the user in terms of what they can control. And so the blow tar was an effort to make that possible. So basically you could explore the space between the flute and the electric guitar. But what was funny is that even in doing that, I found some slight differences between the models. And so I used those differences to create other knobs so that you could sort of fade between one kind of filter in the flute model and its analogous but slightly different filter in the electric guitar, and you get all these other crazy effects.
Yeah.
So, that to me was empowering and also a real lesson in terms of the value of getting your hands dirty, really getting in and making your own stuff. So, these days when I teach, especially like our graduate students in our program here, there's so many high-level tools, and a lot of them, I just want to use what's out there and what's given to me. And of course, that's totally fine. But what you don't get when you just work with high-level tools is this type of opportunity where you're getting your hands dirty and you see, wait, if I hook this to this and I turn this knob a little bit, oh my gosh, I get this whole other crazy thing. And that's just so fun.
That blow tar object is actually, it reminds me so much of like the great and almost uncontrollable instruments, right? I mean, It does have that sense of like a guitar in front of a wall of Marshall amps, right?
That's right.
You turn it on, and if the knobs are right, you can wail. And if the knobs are wrong, it'll squeal, and you'll just run for the door, right?
Exactly.
You'll go hit the power switch, or it won't do anything.
Right, exactly. Sometimes, it'll be squealing, and then you turn the knob one tick, and the whole thing just goes silent. What happened?
I know.
It's a very moody beast. I
But
love that about it.
yeah, on the other side, calling it a beast is right because it seems almost alive,
Yeah,
which that's something that's a rarity in these days where, there are safety bumpers put on our software to prevent us from cocking things up.
right.
And one of the things I like about some of these models is no bumpers, man. You're running, and
Right.
it's really fun and really pretty inspirational, I think.
Well, yeah, and also you mentioned back at that day, 1997 or whatever it was, to be able to even hear just the flute physical model. I mean, the flute physical model, beautiful.
Right.
And to hear that sound coming out of the computer and changing as you're turning a knob, and
Nobody
being
had
able
ever
to
imagined.
no, and to be able to wrap it up in certain ways in your own sort of customized environment. Oh man, you asked me earlier about things that sort of kept me going and kept me interested. These sorts of things, just being able to get your hands dirty, but then get sound like that. I mean, just so exciting.
Sure. Now, to this day, what are the computer music tools that you're still using?
Right. So today, my workbench consists of Max, Chuck, which is a text-based programming language that was actually developed here at Princeton while the laptop orchestra was developing.
That's really oriented towards real-time coding, right?
Well, uh, that was one of the original ideas. So Go Wong is at Stanford, and he was a grad student here at the time. He developed Chuck, and that was his dissertation. And his idea was that it would be a live coding environment. I've never live coded in my life.
Okay, all right.
To me, it's really quite a beautiful language and a really wonderful complementary language to Max, in that it really is so different than Max that it's like you're putting a totally different brain on when you're working with it. And I really like that. I like having these two environments that offer really different ways of thinking about particular problems, or really different ways of just messing around with things. I mean, I can talk more about that if you like, but basically those two languages are the ones that I use when I'm trying to solve a problem or trying to mess with an idea and see where it gets me.
Sure.
So I use Pro Tools and Sibelius and so on otherwise, but I think the Max and Chuck are really where I do most of my work.
Interesting. Let's go back a little bit to the fiddle, because it's clear, it's easy to hear the passion in your voice when you're talking about technology and coding and the excitement of making a computer wake up or crash to its knees or something, right? But you are equally passionate about the fiddle, and particularly the kind of fiddle you use now, which is, before I actually saw you use it, I had never even heard of a Hardanger fiddle. Is that how we'd say it?
That's perfect.
It's a Norwegian fiddle, right?
It's a Norwegian folk fiddle.
Yeah.
It's been used in folk traditions for centuries. As far as I know, it's been around as long as the violin. It's typically used for playing dance music, for playing weddings. I played it for a wedding just last month. And also they have a whole repertoire of music which they call listening tunes, which are tunes meant to be sort of played in concert and not danced to.
I see. What's the difference between this fiddle and a typical violin?
It's a bit of a contraption. So it's got the four strings and on the bridge and everything, but it also has an additional set of sympathetic strings that run underneath the fingerboard and through the middle of the bridge. So
it runs parallel to the regular set of strings?
Right, exactly. It's parallel and underneath. Yeah,
That's weird.
It is weird, and it's funny if you hold up the instrument sort of back by its butt and look through the bridge, you'll see this opening where the resonating strings actually rest on their own part of the bridge, and then there's a tunnel underneath the fingerboard that the strings go through, and then they come out the top where we've got a whole mess of pegs
Right.
for tuning both the main strings and these, as in Norway they call them understrings, because
Okay.
they're the strings that are underneath.
Well, that explains a bunch because I remember when you first pulled it out of the case, I was like, "Oh, well, whatever fiddle this is, it's the big fiddle," because it just seemed like it was physically much more imposing, right?
Well, that's interesting, actually. So the fiddle that you're talking about is not a traditional Norwegian instrument. The fiddle you're talking about is the first of its kind.
Oh, dear.
Yeah. So there's two fiddles that I play. One is the Hardanger fiddle, the traditional Hardanger fiddle that's been around for hundreds of years. It has these sympathetic strings.
Okay.
And it's actually, the body on that fiddle is a little bit smaller than a regular fiddle.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, it's smaller, and the instrument's tuned up quite high. The strings are a little bit shorter, and it's not as loud as a regular fiddle. If you try to play regular fiddle and Hardanger fiddle together, it can be a bit of a struggle for the Hardanger fiddle to actually hold its own.
Right.
But it's got this high, sparkling type of sound, and a relatively small body. So, yeah, let me tell this story, actually, because I think it's relevant to everything we're talking about here. I love this instrument, and I love the sound of it. And these resonating strings, Perry always described them as being, as them basically simulating a built-in reverb unit with carefully tuned modes.
Right.
So the strings are tuned to support particular, pitches or overtones.
Sure.
And so some notes that you play really engage them and make the instrument ring, while other notes that you play don't so much. So it's got these carefully tuned modes, but it's got this beautiful reverberant sparkle, and it's in all the wrong keys if you're a fiddler, because it's basically a whole step higher. So its most natural key is B or F sharp.
Oh,
Yeah,
awesome.
so
Everyone
yes,
else in the band loves you.
exactly. Well, certainly, like playing with other fiddlers, it's like, oh, man, I can't do all the double stops that you guys do
Right.
because I'm in the wrong key. And if I tune it down, then the instrument gets all flabby and weak and loses its magic.
Sure.
So, like I was talking about with the laptop orchestra, I like to play music with other people, and I found this frustrating. And after some years of thinking about this and playing with various fiddlers, and also working with some American fiddlers who play 5-string fiddles. So in addition to having the normal 4 strings, they'll have a low string, sort of like a violin and a viola put together. So I commissioned a Norwegian maker, great Norwegian maker of Hardanger fiddles, to make me a 5-string Hardanger fiddle that was meant to be tuned at A440. And this guy, wonderful spirit, his name is Salve Hakadal. And I sent him this idea over email, and he just went bananas and started sending me sketches for what the instrument would look like. Maybe 9 months later, I went to his shop in Norway, and he had made this absolutely stunning instrument. And it is the one that you're talking about, because it's actually the size of a small viola, so it's bigger than a violin, and it's got the low string, and it's tuned at A440. It's quite powerful.
Right.
And really, I can play very high, very low, but it still has the sympathetic string so that it rings and reverbs and sparkles the way the Hardanger fiddle does. So even with the fiddle, I haven't been able to resist mucking around with it and trying to, make it do what I want it to do.
Sure. Well, that's interesting, because also it seems like this fiddle is almost like a technological, it's like violin 2.0 in some way.
Yeah.
Or like, or maybe like the three-legged version, the mutant violin. And
That's right.
to what extent is that a draw for you? Just the fact that it's peculiar, but also has this kind of unique power.
I think part of the draw of it being peculiar, and this is true with the original Hardanger fiddle actually as well, is that it's liberating, because I grew up playing, like I said, violin, playing Mozart and Brahms, and feeling like that was not my music.
Right.
feeling like I was wearing somebody else's clothes or something. And to this day, whenever I pick up a classical violin and put it under my chin and start playing, that music comes back because that's what I grew up playing. And it starts to feel like this alien creature under my chin rather than something that I'm meant to explore and invent and play and so on. Whereas the Hardanger fiddle and then this new 5-string fiddle that I have, they're enough different that I don't feel that at all. But at the same time, the years of having practiced with my, fingers in order to get them to play in tune and try to draw a decent sound from the instrument, that training is still there. It's just it gets, turned sideways by 5 degrees, and now it's a completely different world, and I'm not hearing Mozart and Brahms. Instead, it's like, well, what am I hearing? So trying to invent stuff there, trying to come up with new music there. So I think the peculiarity is in this case, it's what makes it liberating.
Well, that's really interesting because one of the things that I often kind of rant and do my street preacher thing about is the fact that a lot of people in the electronic music world don't spend the time to become virtuoso with something before the next new shiny object comes along, right?
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like, at least in this variant of technology, which is like advanced violin technology, you found a way to sort of like maintain, you find a way to pivot so that you could do new and interesting things while still maintaining your virtuosity for that particular instrument, right?
I think there's something to that, and part of it, I think that the technique that we learn through studying traditional instruments is not accidental. It's not without value in its own right, apart from the specific instrument that you play. You think about playing the piano, or even for that matter, typing. I mean, there's a certain inherent value in our ability to type, regardless of whether we're using that skill to type words or not. So leveraging that has always seemed to me to be not only smart just because it's there, but like the violin, just the pose that you have playing it with one arm drawing a bow across the strings and the left hand stopping strings with your fingers. I mean, that as a physical way of making music seems to me to have more value than just being about playing the violin.
Right.
So I found that to be useful when thinking about building new instruments and so on, that how we are engaging physically with whatever it is, whether it's a piece of wood with strings on it or something that's coded up digitally, being aware of the fact that there are certain physical things that seem to have some kind of value or power. I think that's at least for me, that's been very useful. And it's not. It's funny. I have really mixed feelings about virtuosity in the sense that a lot of what I do as a fiddler depends on having played and practiced, and I've practiced a lot over the years. Definitely put in way more than my 10,000 hours.
Right.
And I couldn't do a lot of what I do without that. But on the other hand, with computers, and like I think about the laptop orchestra, one of the things that I really love about the laptop orchestra is that you can in some ways define that barrier to entry differently. You can make things that don't require that, but still might have real value as a musician. In fact, I think about, like this is one of the early pieces for the Princeton laptop orchestra that Go Wong made called Clicks, C-L-I-X. Incredibly simple thing where you're typing on the computer to just basically fill a buffer full of clicks that then gets synchronized via a network. There's basically no skill involved.
Right.
You can teach somebody to play this piece in 5 to 10 minutes. And yet, it's extraordinarily fun. And what I've seen happen again and again with that piece is that a group of people will sit down and say, oh, well, cool, well, what if we try this? Right. And what if we try to move it around the room this way? And people start thinking musically, even if they haven't really been in an ensemble before. And so, um, yeah, so I guess what I'm saying is that I definitely value virtuosity, and I value spending a lot of time with a particular approach. But I also feel like, especially with computation where there's so much to do and so many possibilities, just thinking about different ways in and trying to make ways in that are inviting and fun and maybe don't require more than 5 minutes as opposed to 10,000 hours, that's also super valuable and interesting.
Well, to a certain extent, doesn't electronic music almost, speaking of leverage, doesn't it almost like leverage your thinking time into being kind of part of that 10,000 hours? And beyond that, the thinking time of the person who made the software gets leveraged by the person playing. And all of a sudden, that clicks thing doesn't happen in the first 5 minutes of everyone involved. Right.
Right. Absolutely. And I remember talking about this with Curtis Bond, who I mentioned earlier, because when we gigged regularly for probably 8 years, and each gig would be different because the instruments that we were building would be in a new stage because we were constantly hacking at them, and we'd be hacking at them even between tunes on stage. And so on some level, it was always new to us, and we were sort of beginners with the instruments. But on the other hand, it was sort of like our practice was an instrument building practice, and performing and building became sort of one and the same thing. And so there were loads of hours put into the whole process and practice, even if there might have been only like 5 minutes of experience and 5 minutes of hacking that went into that particular moment. But there are also loads of hours having spent improvising and working together and developing sort of some sensibilities, I guess, for how we want to play music together and how we want to fill a room with sound.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's interesting. Sort of part of what I'm thinking of is not wanting to pass judgment too soon. Like we make things. And sometimes you're right, like we're just on to the next gadget. And I think one of the things that's important is to make things, integrate things, and spend time with them and see what happens after you've maybe even grown bored with them. So that's sort of a longer process. It's not really about virtuosity, but it is about sort of experience and taste and judgment and so on.
Right. Well, boy, I have blown through the time we had set aside for this and then some. But before we go, I have one last question that one kind of thought exercise I want to throw at you. Okay. You had a very interesting route to get to where you are now. What advice would you give to a 20-year-old version of yourself to either make it easier or make it harder or change focus, or would you not want to talk to that person at all?
It's funny you asked that. I had a conversation very much like this just last week with a student at SOSI. This is the So Percussion Summer Institute that's held here at Princeton every summer. And there's a percussion student there who is a percussion and physics major at Chapman College. And he found out I had been a physics major and wanted to talk to me. And I hadn't talked about this in a while. And he was talking about asking questions about, for a senior project, about how to do something that brings, his physics and his music interests together. And, people similar to me saying, oh, well, you should do something with acoustics, and him feeling, I don't really want to do something. and so, yeah, so I actually feel like.
Sounds like you almost met a 20-year-old version of yourself.
It's true. It's funny. Yep. Yes, it was really. He's super smart, really fun to talk to. And but I was thinking about it as I was talking to him. I was like, I actually think one of the things that I did that was, I don't know if it was right, but it was important, was to not try to bring them together. I never tried. In fact, and that's not even just with technology. and fiddle music. It's actually like with fiddle music and composition, like writing string quartets or something like that, or writing chamber music pieces and working with technology. I have never been interested in bringing things together. I've always felt like I want to just follow each one of these to where they interest me most individually. So with the Hardanger fiddle, just going completely bananas with this traditional telemark music and not really worrying about whether it has anything to do with anything else I'm doing.
Right.
And same thing with developing electronic instruments or coding, just really following my nose and seeing what's most interesting to me there. Because the last thing you want to do is find the lowest common denominator.
Sure.
Is find the thing that, this is the overlap, and it's the thing that sort of least interests me about both of these.
Or all of them.
Right, exactly. Rather, find the things in your disparate interests that are most interesting and go there and not worry about it. Because it's funny, I've found them to come together again and again and again in spite of my best efforts to keep them apart.
Right. On their own, they do it. Right.
That's
sure.
right. And that's been great.
That's fantastic. Well, Dan, I want to thank you so much for your time. For people that want to check out some of your work, where's the best place for them to look?
ManyArrowsMusic.com is my website, and I've got a bunch of music up there, some software up there, and so on.
Well, that's fantastic. And in the outro, I'll let people know where they can get their hands on the PeRColate stuff,
Great.
Which was just updated for Mac 7. So that's really exciting as well.
It is. Thank you so much, Darwin.
Yeah, thank you. It was great talking to you. Talk to you soon. Bye.
Bye-bye.
And there you have it. What an incredible conversation. And what a cool way to go through your life, kind of combining music performance with coding and composition and teaching. Dan leads a pretty charmed life. Again, if you want to try and experience the PeRColate objects with Mac 7, you're going to want to get the updated version, which is available through maxology.club. It's an amazing thing, and you heard me kind of raving about the blowtar. It's one of the coolest little sound objects you're ever going to run across. But at maxology.club, you also see some of Tom Hall's work, developing some Macs for Life tools with it, as well as some other tutorial information. So head on over there, grab the PeRColate objects. You're going to have a blast with them. Beyond that, I just want to thank everybody for their continued listenership. I want to again congratulate Miller Puckett on an incredible performance this last week. I also want to thank Mark Mosier for helping me put together a great little mini tour. We had a blast. But with that, I'm signing off for the week. I'll catch you next time around. Bye.